Richard Petty speaks slowly now, his voice heavy with the weight of years and memories that refuse to fade. When he talks about Fireball Roberts, time seems to stop. "I still remember the smell of the fire," he once said quietly. You don't forget something like that. There's no bravado in his tone, only sorrow, and a respect that borders on reverence. It's been 6 decades since that terrible day in 1964. But for Petty, it might as well have been yesterday. He can still recall the haze over the track, the confusion, the helplessness as one of NASCAR's brightest stars was swallowed by flames. Fireball Roberts wasn't just another racer. He was the man every driver wanted to beat, and the man every fan wanted to see win. To Petty, he was both an idol and a friend, a figure who defined what it meant to race with grace and courage. When Petty speaks of him, there's a quiet tremor beneath the words, as if he's speaking to a ghost that still lingers at the edge of the track. He remembers the roar of the engines cutting through the Carolina air, the laughter in the garages before the race, the sense of invincibility that young men carried like armor. Then came the fire, violent, sudden, merciless, and that illusion vanished. That day, Petty once said, was when I realized racing wasn't about beating the other guy. It was about surviving. Fireball's death didn't just scar the sport. It carved a permanent mark into Petty's soul. Every time he strapped into a car afterward, he carried the memory of that fire with him. A reminder that legends aren't made by how they win, but by what they leave behind. And even now, as the king looks back across the long road of his life, one truth still burns beneath the surface. What Fireball Roberts gave to NASCAR didn't end in victory. It began in tragedy. What Petty revealed about that day still haunts the sport to this day. Long before the name Richard Petty became synonymous with greatness, he was just a kid from Level Cross, North Carolina. The son of Lee Petty, trying to find his place in a sport still learning what it wanted to be. The late 1950s were raw, dusty, and wild. NASCAR was young, the cars were rough, and the races felt more like brawls than precision sport. Amid the chaos, one man stood apart: Glenn Fireball Roberts. To a young Richard Petty, Fireball wasn't just fast, he was mesmerizing. He carried himself with confidence, spoke with charisma, and looked like he'd been built for speed. Petty would later admit that before he dreamed of being the king, he was just another wide-eyed kid watching Fireball glide across the asphalt with impossible control. He had style, Petty said in an old interview. He made stock cars look classy, like it wasn't just racing, it was showmanship. Where Petty came from hard work and grit, Fireball seemed to float above it all. He was the first true superstar NASCAR ever had. Clean-cut, well-spoken, adored by fans. He made racing feel glamorous, almost poetic. But to Petty, it wasn't the fame that mattered. It was the precision, the calm in the chaos, the way Fireball seemed untouchable. Petty watched, learned, and followed. A student studying a master. And though they came from different worlds, fate was quietly aligning their paths. The kid from North Carolina would one day inherit the crown. But before he could become the king, he had to watch a hero fall and learn how fragile immortality could really be. Before tragedy turned him into a legend, Fireball Roberts was already the man who gave NASCAR its first taste of national stardom. Born in Florida, he was as gifted with a baseball as he was with a steering wheel. His nickname, Fireball, came not from speed, but from the fastballs he threw as a young pitcher, a symbol of the natural athleticism that followed him into racing. Under the mechanical genius of Smokey Yunick, Fireball became unstoppable. Yunick's cars were fast, cunningly engineered, and often controversial, bending rules that hadn't yet been written. But Fireball was more than just the man behind the wheel. He was a symbol of refinement in a sport known for its grit. Clean uniforms, polite manners, a $1,000,000 smile. He brought credibility to a world still viewed as southern and rough-edged. Together, Yunick and Roberts were a perfect storm. Brains and beauty, innovation and instinct. Smokey built the machines, one old mechanic said, but Fireball gave them soul. With every win, every handshake, every photograph, he brought NASCAR closer to legitimacy in the eyes of America. He wasn't just a racer, he was a bridge between the back roads and the big time. His victories at Daytona and Charlotte weren't just numbers on a sheet. They were moments that told the world, this is no longer a backwater sport. This is speed, precision, and courage at its finest. Fireball didn't know it, but he was building more than fame. He was building the foundation of modern NASCAR, the sport Richard Petty would one day inherit. And the friendship forming between them would soon become one of the most poignant connections in racing history. Fireball Roberts and Richard Petty couldn't have been more different. Fireball was polished, the gentleman racer with Hollywood charm. Petty was rugged, the country boy with oil-stained hands and a drawl as thick as the southern air. But beneath the contrast was a bond built on respect. They raced each other hard, but always fair. In an era when tempers often flared and wrecks were settled with fists, these two shared something rarer. Petty looked up to Fireball not as a rival, but as a blueprint. He watched how Roberts carried himself, how he spoke to reporters, how he handled victory, and how he treated fans. He wasn't just competition, Petty recalled years later. He was someone you wanted to be like, until you saw what it cost him. That cost would become painfully clear in 1964. But before tragedy struck, their friendship thrived in mutual understanding. Fireball saw in Petty a younger version of himself, hungry, fearless, and destined for greatness. He offered quiet guidance, small gestures of mentorship that stuck with Petty for a lifetime. They shared garages, laughs, and long nights filled with stories about racing's future. And though neither could have known it then, one would live to carry the other's memory for the rest of his life. Petty once said, "He taught me what racing could be, and what it could take away. It was a lesson that would haunt him forever." It was Memorial Day weekend, warm, bright, and deceptively calm. The World 600 at Charlotte was supposed to be just another race, another chance for the stars of NASCAR to showcase their skill. Fireball Roberts, always the professional, had prepared his number, 22 Ford, with meticulous care. Richard Petty, now one of the sport's rising names, was there too, not just as a competitor, but as a friend watching someone he deeply respected. No one expected what came next. On lap 7, a minor incident ahead of Roberts, Ned Jarrett spinning, Junior Johnson trying to avoid him, turned into a nightmare. Fireball's car clipped the mess at high speed. The Ford spun violently and struck the wall. A second later, the fuel tank ruptured. What followed was hell on earth. A fireball erupted that could be seen across the infield. Crews dropped their tools and ran, but the flames moved faster than men could. Petty would later describe standing frozen, helpless, as the track filled with thick, black smoke. "We weren't trained for that," he said. "We just watched a friend burn." There were no fire suits, no extinguishers nearby, no safety teams like today. It was chaos, drivers, mechanics, and officials rushing toward an inferno with nothing but handkerchiefs over their faces. Fireball was pulled out alive, but barely. The crowd went quiet, sensing they just witnessed something more than a crash. In the silence that followed, one thing became clear to every man on that track. NASCAR had crossed a line it couldn't ignore. The sport that celebrated speed now had to reckon with fire. Fireball Roberts didn't die that day in Charlotte, not right away. He was airlifted to Charlotte Memorial Hospital. His body burned over 80%. For 6 weeks, he fought for his life. Drivers, team owners, and fans visited. But it was Richard Petty who carried those visits in his heart the longest. He remembered the sterile hospital corridors, the smell of antiseptic that could never hide the scent of burned fuel. Petty later said that Fireball still tried to smile, even through the agony. He told younger drivers to be careful, words that carried a gravity few could understand until later. He said the fire don't care who you are, Petty recalled softly. And he was right. When Fireball Roberts died on July 2nd, 1964, the sport lost more than its brightest star. It lost its innocence. The illusion of control, of invincibility, was gone. Petty said the garages were silent for weeks afterward. No laughter, no bragging, just men who understood that what had happened could happen to any of them. Newspapers called it a tragedy. Drivers called it a warning. The fans called it the darkest day in NASCAR's young history. But for Richard Petty, it was personal. After Fireball, he said, racing never looked the same again. That fire forced every man who loved the sport to stare into a mirror and to see not a hero behind the wheel, but a human being playing with death. Fireball's death was the moment Richard Petty stopped believing he was untouchable. Until then, danger was part of the thrill, something distant, something that happened to other men. But watching a friend burn alive stripped that illusion away. It was no longer about fear, it was about purpose. Petty began to race differently. He became more meticulous, more aware of what could go wrong. Behind the stoic blue sunglasses and the easy grin was a man who had seen what the sport could take. We realized then, he once said, we weren't invincible. We were just lucky. Alongside drivers like Ned Jarrett and Junior Johnson, Petty began quietly pushing for changes. Roll cages strong enough to survive impacts. Fuel systems that wouldn't explode on contact. Better seatbelts. And fire protection. Many resisted at first. Safety was expensive, and some thought it made racers look scared. But Petty knew better. Fireball taught us that safety wasn't weakness, he said. It was respect, for life, for family, for the men beside you. That loss hardened him, not with anger, but with resolve. Every time he stepped into his car, he carried Fireball's ghost with him. It wasn't superstition, it was remembrance. Fireball Roberts had shown Richard Petty what it meant to be a legend. Not through glory, but through sacrifice. And from that moment on, Petty wasn't just racing for trophies. He was racing for something bigger, to make sure no one else had to die the way his friend did. Fireball Roberts' death became the catalyst for the greatest transformation in NASCAR's history. What had once been a sport driven by raw courage and mechanical grit was forced to grow up overnight. The flames that consumed Fireball's car burned a truth into the minds of every driver and team owner. Something had to change, or more men would die. In the years that followed, safety became the sport's new frontier. Fireproof suits were no longer optional. They were mandatory. Drivers began wearing multi-layer Nomex gear designed to resist the kind of heat that had once made survival impossible. Fuel cells replaced the thin metal gas tanks that had turned crashes into firestorms. Roll cages became stronger, standardized, and welded into every chassis. What was once seen as unnecessary extra weight now became sacred steel, the difference between life and death. Each innovation bore Fireball's invisible signature. His tragedy forced NASCAR to evolve from reckless daring to calculated endurance. Even fans noticed the shift. No longer was it about who could take the biggest risks. It was about who could survive them. Richard Petty often said that Fireball's death made every driver smarter. It taught them that bravery wasn't about ignoring danger. It was about respecting it. He showed us what it costs to keep pretending we're indestructible, Petty later reflected. We learned that day that heroes don't walk away. Sometimes they make it safer for the ones who do. And though Fireball never got to see the revolution he inspired, his shadow stretched across every track, every fire suit, every reinforced car that rolled into victory lane. His loss had forced the sport to choose between denial and progress. And NASCAR chose to live. Decades later, when Richard Petty speaks about Fireball Roberts, his voice carries the weight of a man who's seen too much and lost too many. The years have softened his words, but not his emotion. He's told the story 1,000 times, but it never gets easier. "When I smell burning rubber," he once said quietly, "I still see him." Fireball. To Petty, Fireball isn't just a memory. He's a warning that rides with him every time the engines start. Petty has said that every major safety feature NASCAR adopted, from fire suits to safer barriers, carries Fireball's spirit in it. "He saved lives," Petty said. "He just didn't live long enough to see it." Even in his later years, as the king of NASCAR, Petty never claimed that his titles or victories defined him. He spoke more often about moments like Charlotte. Moments that reminded him that racing, no matter how glorious, was built on sacrifice. When asked once what he thought Fireball would say if he could see NASCAR today, Petty paused. "He'd be proud," he said, "because nobody dies like that anymore." For Petty, Fireball Roberts wasn't just a rival or a hero. He was the man who forced him and the sport to grow up. Their bond wasn't about wins or records. It was about the understanding that greatness doesn't come from how long you live, but from what you leave behind when you're gone. Even now, when the track falls silent and the engines rest, Petty admits that he sometimes feels Fireball's presence, not in ghostly form, but in gratitude. "Every time someone walks away from a crash," he says, "I think of him." Time has taken nearly everyone from that era, but Richard Petty remains, a living bridge between the dangerous past and the safer future Fireball helped create. He's seen generations of drivers strap in, race hard, crash, and climb out alive. And every time they do, he knows why. When asked what made NASCAR safer, Petty doesn't credit technology, money, or modern design. He credits one man. "People ask what changed the sport," he said. "It wasn't the cars. It wasn't the rules. It was Fireball. He saved more lives than any driver ever could." That statement is more than reverence. It's truth. Fireball Roberts' final race in 1964 ended in tragedy, but his legacy reshaped every race that came after. The suits that protect drivers from fire, the fuel cells that keep explosions contained, the medical crews standing by at every turn. All of it traces back to one man's sacrifice. In the quiet moments of reflection, Petty often returns to the simple memory, the fire, the helplessness, and the promise he made to himself to carry on in Fireball's name. "He burned bright," Petty once said softly, "so the rest of us could race in the light." Now, as the legend walks through the Hall of Fame, the reflection of Fireball's number 22 glinting beside his own blue number 43. It's as if the two are still racing, one leading the way, the other keeping the promise. Fireball Roberts didn't live to see NASCAR's golden age, but his sacrifice ensured it would exist at all. He was more than a driver. He was the light that showed the sport the way forward, and that light still burns every time an engine roars to life.